Hello, and welcome to today's Cyber Threat Alliance webinar. My name is Neil Jenkins, and I'm the Chief Analytic Officer at CTA. We're a nonprofit organization that brings cybersecurity providers together to share information and collaborate on the latest cyber threats. Joining me today from CTA member NTT Security Holdings is Mark Thomas. Mark is the Senior Director for Threat Intelligence at NTT, where he leads the Global Threat Intelligence Center, or the GTIC. He's responsible for building and integrating intelligence capabilities into NTT's platforms, leading global threat research, intelligence management, and sharing alliances. Today, Mark and I are going to be talking about the trends and insights from NTT's 2022 Global Threat Intelligence Report. That report pulls together security data across NTT's global internet traffic, the security operations centers, and their honeypot sensors, and Mark's going to give us some good detail on that when we get started here. That full report is available on NTT's website, security.ntt. You can find the report there. Mark and I are going to discuss some of the insights from the report during our webinar today. If you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them during the discussion. With that, I'll turn it over to Mark to get us started. Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Cheers. Thanks very much, Neil, for having me. So today, as Neil mentioned, what we'll cover is the insights or the observations of the threat landscape from NTT's perspective. And this is actually the 10th year that we've been writing a global threat intelligence report. Suffice to say, every year that we do these things, the results are different. Our research takes a look at a different perspective of things as well. And last year's data led us to some interesting findings for this year as well. So the analysis itself is based on security attacks that we see, as well as real-world security incidents that are detected by our security operations centers, who are monitoring our clients' infrastructure, their security controls, looking at things like threats that are crossing their network. But what really makes us unique is our ability to tap into our own internet backbone, as NTT looks after one of the largest global internet backbones. So that, combined with our honeypot sensors, our research into vulnerability data, all of that is processed and analyzed by the Global Threat Intelligence Center, along with research findings from NTT CERT in Japan. So basically, we collate all of that together. We go through a fairly rigorous analysis process to weed out false positives, understand what the actual data means, and understand what the impacts are to our clients, and therefore what we can be doing better to enhance the security posture of not only our client security posture, but also our own.
Great. And Mark, can you talk a little bit about your customer base, like what kind of sectors you generally support, what regions of the world? That's a very important thing to consider when we're talking about CTA, because we've got members from across the world pulling all those insights together. So can you give us a little bit of sense of that, please?
Sure. I mean, in terms of our customer base, it's the report itself takes a dive into 16 plus different industries. We're not really discriminating one industry against the other. So, for example, we'll look at clients from financial services, technology sector, manufacturing, and so forth. In terms of our client distribution, we have capabilities right across the globe. So from the Americas, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia Pacific region as well. The report itself has a look at all of that data combined to look at things from a global perspective. But what you'll find in the report is that we also take a deep dive into those industries, as well as different regions as well, just so that we can compare and contrast what's happening from both that industry and regional perspective.
Great, thanks.
So the evolving nature of the landscape, as you know, it's constantly challenging the status quo. Society is rapidly changing as organizations look to navigate a very uncertain geopolitical environment. So what we've done is essentially distilled what we think are the 5 key trends that we'll run through here today. So in terms of the outcome from geopolitical conflicts, 2021, we also had COVID pandemic, ongoing supply chain issues, that has all resulted in disruption across many different industries. We're seeing fluctuations in the type of malicious activity, the volumes of activity, and the industries that are most targeted. Attacks more than doubled in both the telco space, so telecommunications, and transport and distribution sector. We also saw that the technology sector was the most targeted overall, with finance and education rounding out the top 4 most industries targeted. In terms of critical infrastructure, I think this explains why we're seeing governments and industry bodies calling for more safeguards into protecting those assets. For example, in some countries, this has meant redefining what it means to be a custodian of critical infrastructure, or a system of national importance, or even what essential service means. But clearly, the world is increasingly connected, and therefore organizations need to be doing more to protect not only themselves, but protect society, critical infrastructure, supply chains that they're a part of, in order to protect our very way of life.
Exactly. And can you define attacks here? How are you using attacks in this context?
So attacks are essentially an event from a detective technology, be it intrusion prevention system, a web application firewall, that is relevant to security. It could have risk implications. That could be, for example, exploitation attempts, vulnerability discoveries, brute force, and so forth. Whereas an incident is a security event that results in damage or actually impacts an asset or a business process.
Great, makes sense. All right, thank you.
And in terms of what we think is interesting here is really around transport and distribution, because it appeared in the top 5 for the first time that we've ever done these reports. And really what we're thinking here is that that's due to the increased reliance on global supply chain and logistics. You have increased virtualization of business process, the shift to remote working as well, changing consumer behavior. Think about, during the pandemic, a lot more people were purchasing goods online, probably more frequently. Transport and distribution is really a part of the vaccine cold chain. And as we reported in last year's report, anyone who was a part of that vaccine cold chain, those industries were the most targeted. Healthcare last year, but this year we're seeing transport and distribution really topping that list.
And do you see that kind of more of these like espionage type attempts to steal data, or are you seeing ransomware, or a little bit of both targeting that?
It is a combination of both. There has been some high profile activity around ransomware deployment against transportation and logistics, certainly here within Australia. But we're tending to see the critical nature of supply chains. You can't get a product from A to B without in some way interfacing with transport and distribution, right? So attackers know this, and they know that if they do deploy the likes of ransomware, you're impacting availability and therefore more likely to pay the ransomware's demands.
Exactly. It's devious, but it's definitely understandable from a business perspective.
Absolutely. The second major trend is the type of assets that are being targeted. So over the past few years, organizations have shifted much of their workloads to the clouds and web-based environments. But that has given rise to more attacks targeting various web applications. I think overall, cloud providers have done a fairly solid job in protecting that infrastructure and the platforms out there in the cloud. But it's really the applications and the data supporting those applications that tends to be under the control of end users. Most businesses these days have a web presence, and it's that footprint which is now actively targeted by attackers who are looking for the likes of misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, weak passwords. But our analysis indicates that about 72% of all attacks are directed towards web and applications. And this continues to rise each year. So for example, what you can see here is that in 2018, that only made up about 32% of attacks. But last year, that's gone all the way up to 72%.
Impressive. Yeah, it just goes to show like the attacks are going to go where the data goes, right? Like that's what's important. So making sure that your applications are secure, that you're patching vulnerabilities, all those kinds of things are super important as you move to the cloud. The cloud's not a cure-all by itself, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think what we've seen as well over the years is the notion of application sprawl, where a lot more applications are being adopted in multi-cloud environments and hybrid environments. So it might be applications deployed in the likes of AWS or Azure, or maybe it's managed on premise. And often a lot of these applications are deployed outside the control of IT, so leading to shadow IT challenges. And where you have further applications exposed online, you're more likely to be exposed to those misconfigurations and vulnerabilities.
Absolutely.
The third trend that we're seeing is in terms of attackers expanding their scope and intensity. We saw about a 30% increase in hostile activity targeting clients. Often this was led by applications and network infrastructure, along with denial of service and credential brute force. In terms of volume, attacks increased for 7 of the top 10 most targeted industries. And here again, it's web application attacks and application-specific attacks, all up in most industries and in nearly every region that we analysed. The proportion of attacks targeting the top 3 industries actually declined, which actually indicates that more industries are experiencing a higher level of hostile activity. The focus is not just on those top 3 industries anymore. I think it also indicates that attacks are moving on to lower hanging fruit, targeting less secure organizations and those that they've traditionally targeted. So all industries are really fair game these days. And when we look at vulnerabilities, we saw the greatest number of newly discovered vulnerabilities compared to any year that we've analysed these reports. So almost 22,000 vulnerabilities, which works out to be a vulnerability being discovered every 24 minutes on average. So I think it gives you some idea around the complex and challenging environment in which both business and security leaders have to navigate.
Absolutely. You're totally right? Like that decrease in those top 3 and top 5 industries looks good, but when you think about it, all that means is you're spreading the pie out a bit more. And so organizations and industries that may not be as well resourced to have defenses in place are now being targeted by opportunistic criminal activity and that kind of thing. One other thing I'd like to note from a CTA perspective on the Log4j vulnerability, we talk about one of our founding principles in CTA is bringing security organizations together that have different views of the security landscape so that they can combine those views, right? Like if you're seeing more stuff in Asia versus somebody seeing more stuff in Latin America, being able to get those views across from each other. Log4j was interesting because essentially every CTA member that we've talked to about this saw that big increase in looking and scanning and targeting Log4j vulnerabilities within their client base along that same timeline. So that really goes to show, like, if everybody was seeing it, that scanning was indiscriminate, that scanning was widespread, it was worldwide, and they were just kind of looking for whatever vulnerabilities they could find. It didn't really matter what organization had the vulnerability, they were just trying to get in.
No, 100%. And often you'll find that there's very large global trends that impact everyone, but you also often find that there might be a type of vulnerability or a threat that has very nuanced occurrences in a specific country or region. But Log4j was just one of those things that everyone was hit all at the same time.
Exactly.
So in terms of the next key trend, so Trojan deployments are increasing, and we're again seeing botnets resurface. So we saw the increased use of banking Trojans, which demonstrates the rise in cyber criminal activity, often motivated by financial motivation. whilst increased deployments of other types of remote access Trojans suggest a rise in espionage, theft of intellectual property, and other trade secrets. I think it also indicates an attacker's desire to maintain control of their victims long term. It's not necessarily about smash and grab attacks these days, although that does still occur. But we're seeing a lot more activity that involves malware with the intention to maintain persistence within the compromised environment. So, for example, Trojans accounted for about 65% of all malware detections in every industry that we analysed, excluding education, and that's up 35% from previous years. The other interesting finding was that cryptocurrency miners dropped significantly to 6%, down from what 41% a year prior to that. So there has been some fluctuations in terms of malware overall.
Yeah, that's a really big drop with the cryptocurrency miners. Do you have any theories as to why that was the case?
I think a couple reasons. Firstly, you've had a crackdown on cryptocurrency mining in some countries, particularly in Asia. But second, I don't know about you, but the cost of energy here has gone through the roof. So I think one way to detect cryptocurrency mining happening within any organization is just look at the power bills. Are they increasing? Cryptocurrency miners is one of those things that causes that. But third as well, if you think about 2021, during the pandemic, there's a lot of people still working from home. Mm-hmm. With that whole notion of working from anywhere, if people are no longer going to the office where they have all of these security controls in place, if they're working from home, you don't have that visibility anymore. So I think that's why we've kind of seen that fluctuation on a year-to-year basis. But I do think this year and probably the coming years, you'll start to see cryptocurrency mining increase, because what we do find is that the price of crypto mining correlates to higher activity. So the more activity that you see correlates to higher values of cryptocurrency miners for the likes of Bitcoin. If that drops, for example, as it has now, I think it's down 70% in value, you tend to see less activity around that.
Yep. Great, makes sense. Thanks.
Next trend is ransomware. What a surprise. Almost 1 in 4 incident response engagements that we were involved with were related to ransomware, which is actually about a 240% growth from what we saw back in 2019. So again, a significant increase here. This activity indicates that organizations are increasingly challenged in defending and responding to those types of incidents. The industries who most frequently call upon us to assist in those engagements: retail, manufacturing, insurance, technology, and healthcare are also not far behind. But there was no shortage of incidents in the news around the impacts of ransomware that it's having on industries. But from what we see anyway, the most common method that attackers are adopting is via email containing malicious links or attachments. And we know that from our research that the average ransomware demands have been up in the past couple of years as well. And I think this really results in why we've seen so many different industry bodies and government agencies establish the likes of ransomware task force initiatives to facilitate the enhanced sharing of information and improved collaboration, precisely because there is so much of this ransomware activity happening.
Were there any ransomware variants in particular that you saw a lot of, or was it a pretty widespread?
So we do see, widespread malware variants in use, but for us, we see Locky being about 38% of all ransomware variants that we observe, followed by REvil, 27%, and I think Ryuk was close to about 22%. More recently, we've seen the likes of Black Cat and Black Basta. And in terms of whether we see that in one region or the other, we actually see that mostly coming out of the Americas, US. But APAC and EMEA also have their fair share, but predominantly Americas makes up the bulk of ransomware incidents that we see.
Okay.
All right, so on to the global analysis. So I mentioned before, the top industries targeted here, and you can see technology and finance, experiencing the brunt of attacks. But where we've seen the biggest change, and as I've said, is around that transport and distribution sector, now coming in at number 5. And as you can see here, over the past few years, it's really changed, where it used to be at number 11 position. But regardless of industries, regions, and targeted technologies, the volume of web applications and application-specific attacks has continued to increase annually. We're also seeing the likes of denial of service attacks, credential brute force activity, but in most instances, attackers are not leveraging zero-day exploits. Whilst that often gets the headlines, they're looking for the easiest path to compromise their targets. You still have highly sophisticated adversaries, the likes of nation states or state-sponsored actors who may be leveraging zero-day exploits, but the preference is always going to be looking for that simple attack vector, the opportunistic attack. So brute force, password spraying to log into the likes of internet accessible systems, VPNs, remote desktops, web portals. That type of activity has really been common over the past 12 months. So here we have top industries targeted annually for the past 10 years. And we've color-coded this based on the top malware threats that we're observing. Blue indicates Trojan, gray is information stealers. And I think here, what it reveals is that the technology and finance sectors are usually the most targeted. Manufacturing has been on the steady increase over the past few years. And again, it's an industry that's undergoing a lot of transformation, connectedness of things, edge devices, robotic process automation. Education sector, that's a sector that conducts a lot of research on behalf of government and private industry. They store and process vast amounts of IP that's valuable to would-be attackers, and that they don't necessarily have the same level of security posture as the likes of finance and technology does. Healthcare was a prime target over COVID. However, the last 12 months, we've actually seen that decrease quite a lot. On the right-hand side, we see sectors and the most common malware that we observe in their environment. Ransomware disruption became the most significant threat to business continuity. It's really, as you can see here, Trojans and botnets are really dominating the malware landscape. But overall, malware activity in 2021 increased by nearly 50% from the levels that we observed in 2020. And you also notice here that the presence of crypto mining activity in the education sector, that was more present to what we see in any other sectors. In terms of apps and web applications, we've had that trend of cloud computing, which has fundamentally changed the way that organizations and the web infrastructure is supported. It's really the biggest potential target for would-be attackers are those external facing applications. The drivers again being technology transformation, cloud migration, work from anywhere. So it's a significant rise in a trend that indicates attacks are moving up the stack, closer to where application data is actually being processed. And it's not just the proportion of attacks shifting to target web applications, it's the volume of activity as well that has increased 30% over the past 12 months. So key point here, attack volumes increasing, vulnerability discovery also becoming more important here as well. And as we kind of touched on before, Log4j, even though that vulnerability was discovered in mid-December, it was actually the 8th most targeted technology for the entire year. So this gives you some idea just how rampant some of these scanning activity that was occurring in such a short space of time. But I think this calls into question the importance of software supply chain and trust. Do we trust where we're getting our software from? In terms of malware, from a global perspective, Eurosniff was the most detected malware, followed by Ramnet. Eurosniff steals sensitive information. It includes computer and network details, user credentials, and other types of information that it looks for. And over the years, this has gone through various stages of evolution. Source code has been leaked online. There's a lot of malware developers adding new capabilities. So I think it lowers the barrier to entry for cybercriminal operators, leveraging the likes of Eurosniff to use as their payloads. It's common in APAC, common in Japan, but that's different to what we see in Europe. We've witnessed also the resurgence of Emotet and TrickBot banking Trojans. And again, Emotet was something that was taken offline last year, but we saw that resurface in late 2021, whereby it's continuing to provide malware as a service to cyber criminal groups, and often deploys the likes of TrickBot, QuakeBots, Ryuk malware.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought that what your findings on Emotet were interesting, and kind of like the Log4j piece, right? Like, even though it kind of came back towards the end or was discovered towards the end of the year, or came back towards the end of the year, it still ended up pretty high on your lists. Yeah,
absolutely. In terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what we had a look at is some of the potential effects of cyber operations and the potential for spillover into neighboring NATO countries. What we saw is that although physical attacks began in mid-February, cyber operations actually began much earlier. A lot of the time that we see physical presence of Russian military, maybe at nuclear sites or at certain organizations, we actually saw a couple of days or even weeks before cyber operations. And some of the main threats that we see here, everything from data wiping, malware, DDoS activity, disinformation campaigns. I think what it shows is the important role of hybrid warfare and the inherent use of cyber as a critical domain in warfare these days. So just having that level of capability, the cyber capability for use within actual warfare, provides a competitive advantage for those operators who leverage it. But we had a look at some of the Russia and Ukraine conflict that was occurring, and we've actually produced a timeline around that. So you can check out our security blog site on NTT Security Holdings, and you can actually see a timeline that showcases the physical events and some of the cyber operations that are happening, hand in hand.
Yeah, I would recommend that anybody listening definitely go and check out that blog. It's a really great list of the events that were happening. I know a lot of work went into that. So it's really, really good, really important, really comprehensive.
And one of the things that we had a look at as well, just leveraging our internet backbone telemetry, was the likes of Ransomware APT Group. And this is a pro-Russian group that's been around since 2013. They leverage spear phishing to target their victims, but we were able to identify not only that this group was active prior to the physical conflict, but we also saw that they had compromised additional victims outside of Ukraine into other NATO countries. So what it suggests is that cybercrime and cyber warfare in general, it's borderless, right? And we often don't know what impact a compromise will have on a specific company or even country these days. But this is a group that deploys various types of clustering tools based on the campaigns that they use for phishing and malware distribution. So they maintain different clusters just depending on the campaign that they're leveraging. So in this case, Gamma Redden, they use PowerShell, Ultra VNC, and custom backdoors to target their victims. So, I mean, in terms of the threats, we've had a look at what has bubbled up to the surface over the past 12 to 18 months. But importantly, is what organizations can do to better protect themselves. And within the report, we've made 5 key strategic recommendations. So everything from security by design, zero trust, patch management, something that always comes up. The importance of continuous monitoring, the likes of threat detection and response, but also for organizations who have various types of data, be it intellectual property, maybe it's financial data, maybe it's healthcare or patient records, to encrypt that data and to build controls around it. And also with the likes of ransomware is to ensure that you're maintaining business continuity and disaster recovery plans. But what we actually looked at is, based on the types of threats that we see, what are the MITRE attack mitigations that organizations can be adopting in order to uplift their security posture. So we've got about 20 or so detective security controls that organizations should really consider investing in to get the best bang for buck that we believe is aligned to the types of threats that we were seeing. So here it's not just technical controls, but it also is all about user education as well, making sure that people know not to click on links and open malicious attachments. Patching, configuration hardening, also important, multi-factor authentication these days, network segmentation, backups. I mean, these real critical things that need to be adopted in order to drive improved security right across the organization, we believe are really important for organizations to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to show that the data you're finding from the intrusions and the attack attempts that you're seeing map back to the attack framework, where the mitigations for those continue to be the basic cyber hygiene things that we still need to see organizations doing, like that multi-factor authentication, account management, password policies, all those kinds of things. It's important to continue to see that. Well, thanks, Mark, for joining us today. We know it was a late evening for you. We really appreciate you joining us. And thank you for the audience for joining us as well. Again, thanks to Mark. Be sure to head over to security.ntt to check out to get a copy of the Global Threat Intelligence Report, and also take a look at that blog on Russia-Ukraine activity to get a good analysis of how NTT sees the conflict, and an excellent timeline there. Finally, if you're interested in membership in the Cyber Threat Alliance, please go to our website at cyberthreatalliance.org and learn more about us. You can click contact to reach out to our membership team, and we'll get back to you. But we definitely appreciate your time today, everybody, and thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thanks very much.